The hype train can be a dangerous ride. Games like Cyberpunk 2077 and No Man's Sky taught us that a flop isn't always the final chapter. Both titles stumbled hard at launch, buried under waves of bugs, unmet promises, and fan backlash. Yet, through relentless patches and updates, they clawed their way back to respectability, even admiration. Unfortunately, not every game gets the chance to redeem itself. Some crash and burn, leaving a trail of disappointment and broken dreams. This is a nod to those titles that never quite made it. 15 games that flopped so hard you wish they stayed in development. First up, we have Marvel's Avengers. So, The Avengers is one of those games that kind of breaks your heart a little when you think about it. Here's this massive franchise with millions of fans. The potential for a blockbuster game is right there. And the hype is unreal. We're talking about the same Marvel universe that utterly dominated cinema for the better part of a decade. It could have been the most ambitious crossover in gaming too, yet the execution just kinda fizzled. And let's be honest, the moment you realized that the game was riddled with bugs and lacked engaging content, it was like realizing your favorite superhero movie was nothing but CGI with no story. Crystal Dynamics worked so hard to try and save it, you could sense the dedication in their patches, but you could also sense the underlying problems were too deep. Then you have those design choices that just boggled the mind. Like, why wasn't the gameplay loop rewarding? The loot felt unsatisfying, and then there were those so-called enhancements that did little to nothing for the overall experience. And don't even get me started on how the characters looked like they're stunt doubles instead of the real deal. It left the whole thing feeling, let's say, uninspired. It's like they took the most beloved IP and somehow made a game that was forgettable. I'd bet my Captain America comic that many still want to forget this one even existed. While we're still talking about superhero stuff, I also had to mention Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League. So how do you go from Batman Arkham Knight, one of the most beloved superhero games of all time, to Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League? I mean, Rocksteady's track record had everyone thinking that this is going to be good. We were all hyped. It's the freaking Suicide Squad, for crying out loud. And then the gameplay reveal happened. Instead of that signature, tight, melee-focused combat that made the Arkham series so satisfying, we were shown a live service shooter with characters bouncing around shooting color-coded weak points. It felt like Rocksteady was trying too hard to follow trends rather than sticking with what they were known for. And why did every character have guns instead of leaning into their unique abilities? Deadshot, sure, but King Shark with a minigun? I'm just speechless. And don't get me started on the always online requirement for a single-player campaign. Just why? I remember watching the fan reactions, the immediate backlash. They were livid. This wasn't the Rocksteady we knew. People hoped for a game with the depth and polish of Arkham, and instead, what we saw looked like it was chasing trends without understanding why people fell in love with those earlier games. Following the backlash, the game was delayed again, probably in an effort to try and salvage something from the wreckage, but the damage was done. It felt like everything people cherished about the Arkham series was washed away, replaced by a formulaic, soulless experience that nobody asked for. Next up is Redfall. So let's break this one down. Even before its release, it felt like it had the momentum behind it, right? A co-op vampire shooter from Arcane Austin? That's a pitch that sells itself. Except, well, it didn't. I remember those initial trailers, how eerie and stylized everything was. It really felt like this could be the next big thing on Game Pass. Come release day though, and things were a hot mess. I'm not even sure where to start. Maybe the bugs? Or maybe the AI that felt like it was wandering around on a coffee break. It all just felt so undercooked. There's nothing worse than buying into the hype only to end up with a game that feels like it should still be in beta. The world of Redfall could have been genuinely gripping, with its twisted take on a New England town overrun by powerful vampires, but it was hard to stay immersed when every other minute you're getting pulled out by a janky animation or a nasty bug. People wanted to love it too, like genuinely wanted it to be good. It had all this charm, all this atmosphere on paper, but in execution, it crashed. And okay, maybe the game's in a better state now after patches, but you know what they say about first impressions. Redfall should have been scary for all the right reasons, but instead, it was terrifying for all the wrong ones. Up next is The Day Before. Now, if there's a recent example of hype crash landing face first into reality, it has to be this one. I'm not sure if you followed all the pre-release buzz, but this game had everyone's attention for a while there. The trailers looked slick, like ridiculously polished. Post-apocalyptic vibes, zombies shambling around, a world that seemed to merge The Last of Us with The Division. It felt like a recipe for gold. Except, well, here's the thing. It's too good to be true, right? Yeah, that's kind of what happened. You had people eagerly watching every trailer and screenshot drop, social media buzzing about how this was going to redefine the genre. And yet, something always felt a bit off, didn't it? First, there were delays, excuses about needing more time to perfect things. You get that in game development, sure, but then there's the whole other level of where did this game even come from? And by this game, I mean one that seemingly came out of nowhere. Developed by Fantastic, a studio with a fairly low-key resume before this, there were always murmurs of skepticism, and rightfully so. And when it finally showed up, it wasn't just underwhelming. It was kind of mystifying in how much it failed to live up to its initial promise. The game world was empty, the AI was laughable, and the gameplay loop was flatter than you'd expect from such a visually enticing concept. What seemed at first like a polished experience was more like a hastily thrown together tech demo that somehow got greenlit as a full title. People felt scammed, to be honest. The delays, the hype, the teases, they all led to a release that didn't just fail, it kind of imploded. And the unfortunate cherry on top, accusations started flying about how the game borrowed a bit too liberally from its inspirations, leading some to question how much of it was original or even ready for public consumption. Up next, we have Saints Row Reboot. Let's talk about this one too. Remember when the series was this wild, over-the-top parody of everything that made open-world games fun? The attacks, the ridiculousness, the mobility, the reboot just didn't hit those same notes. I don't know what exactly went wrong, but something definitely did. There was this fire in the original series of games that made it exciting, capturing UFOs, fighting with dildos, or running your own crime empire, stuff that only Saints Row got away with. The reboot sort of sidesteps that identity in favor of way more generic gameplay and characters that just didn't resonate with fans. It felt like such a missed opportunity compared to what had come before, a sterilized version of what made Saints Row, well, Saints Row. The humor felt forced, the world didn't have that same chaotic energy, and honestly, it just didn't feel like coming home to Stillwater. When you have a character like Johnny Gat from the original, this icon of the series, you almost can't help but feel disappointment with the reboot. It's like that nostalgia was left at the door, and yet you can almost tell they tried. It's all just a shame, honestly, a real gut punch for longtime fans. Next up, we have Anthem, a game with flying exosuits. Surely nothing could go wrong there. Except, wow, everything did. Anthem was this strange concoction of interesting ideas that just never went anywhere. BioWare promised the stars, but the game barely cleared the ground. There was this whole pre-release hype that made you think, yes, Destiny meets Iron Man. And then reality set in. Endless repetition, a clunky loot system, and missions that were just the very definition of rinse and repeat. Can we talk about how all that innovation with the jetpacks, and it felt like that was the only appealing thing? You fly in anticipation, hoping your next mission or loot drop will finally be fun, but no, just disappointment. And really, that's the word for Anthem. Disappointment. After games like Mass Effect, which felt like they were crafted with such love and attention, this just fell flat. There are those who'd argue Anthem wasn't that bad, and yeah, maybe the core flying mechanics were solid. But that's just one part of a loot shooter, and when the loot isn't even gratifying, what are you left with? A beautiful but hollow shell, much like the world Anthem tried and failed to give us. Another flopped game is Skull Island: Rise of Kong. Where do I even start with this game? It's almost like the game was trying to set new records in how not to make a licensed title. You'd think that with a franchise like King Kong, there would be so much potential for a bombastic, larger-than-life adventure. I mean, it's Kong. Imagine the sheer spectacle of battling giant creatures, exploring mysterious jungles, and unraveling the lore of Skull Island. I mean, it looks like a gold possibilities, right? But instead, what we got felt more like a relic from an era long gone. If that era was the early 2000s bargain bin. Developed by Iguana Bee, a relatively unknown studio, it wasn't just rushed. It looked and played like it was cobbled together at the last minute. From the dated graphics that wouldn't have looked out of place on a PS2, to the cringe-inducing voice acting, nothing about this game screamed modern. In fact, it was less of a scream and more of a whimper, a reminder of why so many people cringe when they hear licensed game. And there comes the gameplay. Imagine playing as Kong, one of the most powerful creatures in fiction, but everything feels sluggish, awkward, and pointless. The combat was repetitive, the platforming unforgivably clunky, and the boss fights lacked any real challenge or creativity. It was like they took the word king out of King Kong, leaving you with just Kong. When you think about what could have been, it's frustrating. This game should have been an epic tribute to one of the most legendary characters in cinema. Instead, it's the kind of game you might stumble upon during a deep discount sale and then regret even that minimal investment. A missed opportunity that landed with an absolute thud. Next up is The Lord of the Rings Gollum. So, how does a game starring one of the most iconic characters in all of fantasy lore flop so hard? Yeah, that's the story with The Lord of the Rings Gollum. A game taking you on an adventure with Gollum should have been a unique slice of Middle-earth, but what we got instead was just confusion and frustration. Lots of frustration. Gollum has a lot going for him as a character, a twisted psyche, a tragic backstory, and he's just so darn creepy. But when it came to adapting that into gameplay, things went sideways. The graphics felt dated, which was weird considering the level of detail we've come to expect in Middle-earth games. Then there were the controls. Clunky's putting it nicely. In a game where stealth is key, the mechanics just fell flat, and that's being generous. Remember those sequences where you're trying to navigate through some obstacle, only to get sniped by poor hit detection or pre-rendered death animations that just didn't belong in this era? Very unpleasant. The whole experience felt like a missed opportunity, a stumble when it should have been a deft leap. The grand, expressive Tolkien world was boiled down to bland, routine tasks, more frustrating than they were engaging. Gollum himself felt almost disconnected from the story. You almost wish they just shelved the whole concept and never tried. Would have saved everyone a lot of grief. Another post-apocalyptic zombie game that fall flat is Overkill's The Walking Dead. Imagine getting your hands on the Walking Dead license. You've got this zombie-loving fan base, people who are obsessed with anything undead related, probably foaming at the mouth for a game that could fill the void left by Telltale's series. So, how exactly does it all go so completely wrong? Well, Overkill's The Walking Dead serves as a case study in project management disasters. Initially, the project was supposed to shine, especially with Starbreeze backing it after the success of Payday. But the thing is that constant engine swapping was its death sentence. One engine to another, the game's own footing got shaky, and the outcome? Well, it felt like a rushed mess. It's like they never had a solid plan from the start, and by the time they switched to Unreal Engine, which mind you was the third engine choice, it was too late to salvage the sinking ship. When the game finally dropped in 2018, it was clear that all that development hell had taken its toll. Despite the pedigree of the studio and the sky-high expectations, what players got was something stiff, buggy, and just not any fun. And that's the kicker. How do you mess up zombies in a co-op shooter? That genre pretty much writes itself. The reviews felt almost resigned, like no one was really shocked that it didn't live up to the hype. Starbreeze put all their eggs in this basket, and with the dismal sales, they ended up restructuring. It wasn't just a lost game, it was a loss across the board. Staff layoffs, property sell-offs, and a complete collapse of faith in the brand. A dream project that became a nightmare. While we're still speaking of The Walking Dead, Flux Games' The Walking Dead Destinies is also considered as a flop. Now, The Walking Dead games have had their ups and downs, but there was something different about The Walking Dead Destinies. When it was first teased, people were curious. What new angle could they possibly explore in the zombie apocalypse? It wasn't as if the universe needed more exploring. After all, Telltale's Walking Dead series left such a deep mark on the gaming community. But Destinies presented an opportunity, a chance to play with the timeline, to perhaps correct or diverge from the TV show's lore. Except, once again, that promise fell flat on its face. From the get-go, you could feel that Destinies was on shaky ground. The gameplay mechanics were clunky, reminiscent more of something from a bygone era of gaming than what we expect today. They tried to innovate with a branching narrative system, but it felt more like a gimmick than a meaningful feature. The changes you made didn't shake up the world as much as they should have, making the whole experience feel like you were just going through the motions. On top of that, the visuals, it was like the apocalypse hit the budget too. It lacked the polish we've come to expect from modern titles, with character models looking more like off-brand action figures rather than the haunted survivors we know from the series. The atmosphere, the key selling point of any Walking Dead game, just wasn't there. Players didn't flock to it. They trickled in with tempered expectations, and even those were crushed by the lackluster execution. It's one of those games that had potential in concept, but failed miserably in execution, leaving fans wondering if The Walking Dead has anything left to offer in the gaming world. Next up is Diablo 4. Many of you may disagree with me, but I really think that this one is a flopped game. Blizzard's classic franchise, Diablo, carries a certain weight in the gaming world. We've all either played it or heard stories of endless dungeon crawling and loot farming. Diablo 3 had a rocky start, but people were eager to see Blizzard redeem themselves with a fresh installment. The trailers for Diablo 4 were dark, gritty. They promised a return to the series' gothic roots, something fans were craving after the somewhat colorful vibe of the third game. But then there was launch day. At first glance, it felt like they nailed the aesthetic. Everything looked darker, more menacing. But as you dove deeper, it quickly became apparent that something vital was missing. The game was trying too hard to straddle the line between honoring its roots and modernizing for a new audience. And somehow, it wasn't quite hitting either mark. The grind was real in ways that felt more mundane than satisfying, and the gear system, usually the crown jewel of Diablo titles, lacked that addictive quality that kept people coming back in past games. It was almost like they missed out on what made the loot so compelling in the first place. Instead of making you feel powerful with every epic drop, it just felt like busy work. Add to that the ongoing frustration from server issues and mandatory online connectivity, and it's easy to see why people weren't exactly singing praise. Blizzard's monetization strategies didn't help either, with some feeling that the game was leaning a bit too hard on microtransactions, cheapening the experience. It just wasn't the course correction that longtime fans hoped for. What should have been a triumphant return for the series ended up being a grim reminder that even the most beloved franchises can lose their way. Up next is Skull and Bones. You might have to sit down for this one. It's been a journey, to say the least. Skull and Bones is a game that's been in development for what feels like an eternity. First announced way back in 2017, this was Ubisoft's attempt to cash in on the pirate craze sparked by the naval battles in Assassin's Creed 4 Black Flag. People were buzzing at the idea of a full-blown pirate MMO filled with naval combat, treasure hunts, and high seas shenanigans. That's the dream they sold us anyway. But the reality is a whole lot different. For starters, the game has been delayed more times than I can count, and every time it got pushed back, the excitement waned. By the time it finally crawled into a beta phase, it was clear that the years of development hell had taken a toll. The game felt outdated, the mechanics were uninspired, and it seemed lacking in the very soul that makes a pirate adventure thrilling. And here's the kicker. The game's focus had shifted so many times during development that it almost didn't know what it wanted to be. Player versus player battles, cooperative treasure hunts, shallow quests, nothing felt fleshed out, and nothing felt rewarding. The ships looked good, sure, but what's the point of a game that looks like a pirate's paradise if it plays like a monotonous grind? Ubisoft kept throwing lifelines at it, beta tests, rebranding efforts. But at this point, Skull and Bones felt less like a game and more like a desperate attempt to salvage something, anything from all those years and dollars sunk into it. It's like being excited for a grand voyage, only to find out you're stuck in a rowboat with no oars or wind in your sails. Next up, we have Payday 3. Okay, this one stings a bit, especially if you're a fan of the franchise. Payday 3 had some seriously high expectations riding on it. Payday 2 was, and still is, a staple in the multiplayer FPS genre. Bank heists, endless mods, dynamic gameplay. Not to mention the priceless community moments where plans go south in the most spectacular ways. So, when Payday 3 was announced, people were excited, to say the least. Yet, here we are, and Payday 3 feels more like a step backward than the triumphant return we all wanted. First off, the launch itself was riddled with server issues, frustrating fans who just wanted to dive back into the thrill of orchestrating the perfect heist. It was like the developers didn't anticipate the level of demand, which is wild considering how popular the series is. Imagine getting all your buddies together, only to spend most of your time battling connection issues instead of security guards. Even beyond the technical problems, something just felt off. The game tried maintaining that core Payday formula, but it fumbled in delivering anything new or exciting. The missions felt formulaic, with less of that chaotic unpredictability that made Payday 2 so much fun. And the monetization, let's just say that was a bitter pill to swallow. A game tailor-made for co-op fun, bogged down by aggressive pricing for cosmetics and content packs. You know, Payday should be all about crazy, adrenaline-fueled fun with your friends, but Payday 3 just couldn't capture that magic, leaving us questioning how many more sequels could be justified, if any. Up next is Forspoken. When this game first came on the scene, it had this air of mystery and intrigue. Developed by Luminous Productions, the same team behind Final Fantasy XV, it looked like something truly new. The magical parkour, the stunning visuals, and this vast, mystical world. It was easy to get sucked into the hype. Finally, a fresh IP that wasn't just another sequel or reboot. We all had high hopes. Then, you jump in, and it doesn't take long for the cracks to show. Sure, the world's pretty, but what good is an expansive map if it's empty? The combat had its moments, especially when you're zipping around casting spells left and right, but the gameplay loop felt shallow. After that initial rush of trying out new abilities, it quickly turns into a grind. It's like the game just doesn't know how to keep you engaged beyond the surface-level spectacle. And let's talk about the story for a second. There's so much potential that's just left untapped. Despite having a strong premise, the narrative is bogged down by pacing issues and a protagonist who, while full of attitude, lacks the depth to carry the story. The dialogue too, oh man. Let's just say cringe-worthy and move on. The disappointment was palpable. Forspoken wasn't bad by any means, but for a game that promised so much, it ended up just missing the mark, making it a waste of what could have been a truly groundbreaking new franchise. It's the kind of letdown that sticks with you because it had every reason to be amazing, but somehow tripped over its own ambition. And finally, we have Conquered. This is undoubtedly the worst flop in the gaming history that I've ever seen, and yes, this game was the reason why I decided to make this video. Imagine a project that had been cooking for 8 years. 8 years, folks. That's a long time to develop expectations, ideas, investment. Then, Firewalk Studios comes out with this epic-sounding shooter after being backed by Sony, no less. The build-up was there, the budget, the promise. Yet, even with all that momentum, it somehow ended up being an Achilles heel instead. That live service model was almost like shooting themselves in the foot from day one, given the climate. The market's saturated with hero shooters. How do you stand out? Especially when you decide to price your game higher while leaving it up to players to fund further development with microtransactions. The disconnect between what the game offered and what people expected was huge. When numbers started trickling in, less than 700 concurrent players on Steam, it was like a flat line. No pulse, no chance for resurrection. Firewalk quickly realized the ship was sinking and tried to contain the damage, pulling it from sale, offering refunds like tossing life vests from a boat. But it was too late. The servers were to shut down, to be exact, on September 6th, and Conquered will fade quicker than anyone could have anticipated. In 2 short weeks, a game with a development journey that long just disappeared. It kind of makes you think, with all these hero shooters vying for attention, do you really need another one? It's like ripping the band-aid off. Better to let it hurt and heal quickly than watch the endless struggle. And there we have it, our journey through some of the biggest flops in gaming history. I'm curious, have you played any of these? Or maybe you've got some other games in mind that should have made the list. Let us know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe to my channel. Thanks for sticking around, and I'll catch you in the next one.